Story 1. I see Clint Eastwood pretty often. He still drives himself around town, but he is a horrible driver and really shouldn't have a license anymore. Story 2. I met Bill Clinton once. Regardless of your feelings toward him, I found him extremely personable. It felt almost like running into an old friend, even though I had obviously never met him before. That's the only way I can describe it. It's not surprising he was a successful politician. Story 3. The singer from the band Toploader is someone I don't know by name, but I saw him in Edinburgh. We made eye contact, and I nodded my head while he smiled. It was a moment he will never forget. Story 4. I used to see Robin Williams occasionally in San Francisco. I also saw Sharon Stone, but you only asked for one. Story 5. I had the pleasure of meeting Richard Simmons once. I was leaving work and saw him walking in his striped shorts. He had just filmed a segment for a local show. I called out to him, and he stopped and turned around with a big smile. As I ran up to him, he said, "Honey, don't run in heels." He was so sweet and funny and gave me his autograph. This was before the days of selfies and smartphones. Story 6. Adam Sandler was referring to himself as the Sandman. I saw him at a store and heard him say, "The Sandman likes this t-shirt," in a very Sandler voice. Story 7. Owen Wilson used to visit the cafe where I worked as a chef. He would sit in the back and relax, mostly left alone. He was always very nice to talk to when he came over to the kitchen to see what we were making. It was an open kitchen, and he would watch us during service. I have a great photo of him and me chatting that a customer took and gave to me. Story 8. Christopher Walken bought us drinks at Barney's Beanery in West Hollywood around 1999 and talked to us for about 10 minutes. It was a super cool experience. Story 9. I saw Jeff Goldblum at the baggage claim in Portland Airport. It was my first time visiting Portland, and it felt like a very fitting first experience in the city. Story 10. I once saw Taylor Swift from a distance, but my friends said it wasn't her and that it's unlikely she sells vegetables in an Albanian flea market. So I'm not sure. Story 11. One night at work as a cocktail server, I turned to a coworker and said, "Check out this stripper who thinks she looks like Paris Hilton." I was surprised to hear, "That is Paris Hilton." This was in 2006. Story 12. David Bowie was at Bleecker Bob's on Melrose. I was so starstruck that I left and called my friends from a payphone. Story 13. If you go to London regularly, you'll see many famous people just walking around. I bumped into Terry Jones from Monty Python at a tube station and saw Andrew Garfield walking across London Bridge. I was at a street market with a friend, and he asked if I had ever seen anyone famous. I pointed out, "That's Bill Nye over there." Once, while waiting at a bus stop with my son, I told him he might see famous people in London. Literally, as I said this, a bus pulled up, and the first person to get off right in front of us was the current companion from Doctor Who. Later that afternoon, he had a conversation with a nice lady in a coffee shop about his choice of sandwich. It turned out to be Helena Bonham Carter. Story 14. Dave Chappelle. My hometown was near Yellow Springs, Ohio, where he lives. It's an eccentric town for the area. I was thrift shopping and visiting the record store with some friends when I saw him downtown. This was after the Chappelle show, and he caught me off guard because he was much more muscular than during his show. I didn't approach him because I would have been nervous, and I was sure that would be bothersome. Story 15 years ago, I was at Sears Point for a race weekend. I was a gopher traveling between Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. The team at Datsun Competition gifted me a ticket and a pass to the hospitality tent. I was a car enthusiast. In the Datsun tent during a social event, the lights dimmed, and a film of various Datsuns racing started to play. A man approached me, and we struck up a conversation. I mentioned that a Datsun 2000 Solex was running too rich, which was evident from the sound. We spent about 30 minutes discussing engines and suspension. Eventually, someone told him it was time to leave, but he stayed because he was enjoying our conversation about cars. Eventually, he was pulled away. Afterward, my friends asked me what I had been discussing with Paul Newman. Story 16. I saw Tim Burton and Helena Bonham Carter strolling down the road in Swiss Cottage. I was on one side of the road, and they were on the other, walking in the opposite direction. They were looking at me while I was looking at them, which felt strange. Story 17. Jennifer Aniston, even more stunning in person than I expected, stood about 5 feet away from me for most of a Saturday in Brooklyn on a movie set. She is by far the most beautiful person I have ever seen in real life. Story 18. Just one. Chevy Chase. He was behind me waiting in line to check out at a convenience store in Vermont during the production of Funny Farm. I simply said hello and expressed my excitement to see the movie. He raised his eyebrows and sarcastically replied, "Great," while making a little frown, which was on brand for his rude demeanor. Story 19. I saw Angie Dickinson in a white Cordoba while crossing Central Avenue, leaving the Park Central Shopping Center in the late 1970s. She was stopped at the light heading northbound, and she had an expression of surprise on her face. She looked very familiar, but I was on the sidewalk, the light changed, and she was gone before I connected the dots. Story 20. I saw Tim Robbins while boarding a plane. He was blocking the aisle as he placed his luggage in the overhead compartment. I waited patiently so as not to inconvenience him, and he looked up, apologetically said, "Oh, sorry," and quickly took his seat. He seemed really nice. Story 21. I sat next to Robert Plant at the back of Kentish Town Forum many years ago. That is probably my most impressive encounter, but the most exciting moment was standing behind Adam Ant in the queue at the train station in the late 1980s. I have seen many famous people, and it's easy to spot them when you live near Brighton. Story 22. Sometime in the mid-2000s, when I was with family in New York, Pink pulled up in front of the Fuse studio and was waving at us passersby. I'm not a big fan of hers, but she seemed cool. Story 23. Recently, I ran into James McAvoy in Brooklyn and Richard Kind in Fulham, London. I was on a flight with Lance Bass and then met Steve-O at baggage claim on the other end. Story 24. Patch Adams. I once saw him at an airport. He is hard to miss with his metallic blue hair, big white mustache, and colorful jacket. He is the most bird-like person I have ever seen. He seems like a nice guy. Story 25. I smoked a joint once with Vanilla Ice. I suppose that wasn't technically in public, but I met him in public just before that. Story 26. I crossed paths with Justin Trudeau at least once while hiking. He was mountain biking seemingly alone, but then some tired-looking Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers passed me about 30 seconds behind him, obviously trying to catch up. I gathered they used to have a hard time finding guards in good enough shape to keep up with him on long rides. Story 27. I was an undergraduate at the Indian Institute of Technology in the late 1980s, and Marvin Kamras would wander into the library and chat with me while I worked at the front desk. It's absolutely astonishing what he produced in over 500 patents, all concerning magnetic tape recording and splicing. In the world of practical scientific achievements, his designs impacted everyone who has ever recorded anything in the last 80 years. Story 28. At least one member of the band Three Doors Down used to live around here. Maybe they still do. My wife and I were at a bar when the bartender came over to tell us who it was. I can't remember if it was just one of them or all of them. Story 29. I saw Sissy Spacek trying to unstick 2 shopping carts at a Super One Foods in rural Northeast Texas. It was not the place I expected to see an Academy Award winner. I never really expect to see an Academy Award winner, but this was especially unexpected. Story 30. I saw Billy Strings at the airport in Nashville as I was returning home to Philadelphia. He was carrying a large guitar case with him. Story 31. I bumped into Drew Barrymore at one of our local malls about 25 years ago. She was very sweet and lovely. The best part is that I didn't realize it was her until after our brief interaction. My friends still tease me about that. Story 32. I saw Boy George at a gay club during a trip to New York City in the early 2000s. He had quite the entourage and looked somewhat off. Other than him, I do not have many notable encounters like a lot of others do. I also saw Bill Weld eating with some family members at a restaurant, long after he was governor and before he was a vice presidential candidate. Furthermore, Eric Montrose, when he was just starting out with the Boston Celtics, came to Christmas Eve service at my church one year. It was obviously him because he was literally 7 feet tall. I recently learned from his Wikipedia page that he passed away from cancer in 2023 at the age of 52. Rest in peace. Story 33. Had coffee and a croissant at a nice hotel when visiting Memphis years ago and shared a table with a very dignified small Englishman. He seemed ordinary enough except for a very proper accent and very blue eyes. We chatted about Memphis and the weather. He was a nice little fellow. We wished each other a good day, and he got up and went on his way just as my wife was arriving. She gasped as she walked up, whispering, "I wish you'd let me know you were having breakfast with Anthony Hopkins." Story 34. Leslie Bibb at a Broadway show, William H. Macy in a restaurant, Tina Fey at an inn in Cape May, New Jersey, and John Slattery at a Broadway show. I recognized a couple of character actors, but I don't know their names. If you're in New York City often, you'll see celebrities here and there. Kevin Bacon is frequently spotted in the city. If you live near Bentonville, Arkansas, you might see celebrities visiting Walmart or attending the Geena Davis Film Festival. I saw Bruce Dern in a restaurant. Oh, and Larry Flynt at the grand opening of the Hustler store in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They wheeled him in on a gold-plated wheelchair, and having worked in the funeral business for several years in the 1980s, I don't think I've seen a living person look as unwell as he did. Story 35. Shawn Michaels, Jeff Hardy, Matt Hardy, Lita, Buff Bagwell, Jeff Jarrett, Bret Hart, Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, Rhino, Farouk, Perry Saturn, and Kanyon are some notable figures in professional wrestling. I used to sit outside professional wrestling events as a teenager. The first Canadian Prime Minister was Kim Campbell. Story 36. When I was in Los Angeles for 3 months visiting friends, I kept running into Sarah Silverman. Each time she stood behind me in line, she smiled at me all 3 times, and she has such a beautiful smile. I probably should have talked to her because she seems like the type of person I would be friends with. Story 37. I saw Guy Fieri at a beer festival in New Jersey. I also saw Kelsey Grammer smoking outside a cigar shop in Manhattan. Story 38. Working at an escape room facility, we had Jordan Subban, whose brothers both played in the National Hockey League, although he mostly played in the American Hockey League. We also had Property Brothers, Zelda Williams, and Joey King, along with just Jared. At a different job, I worked with Andrew Fung. Story 39. Living in New York, the chances of encountering a celebrity are high. When I worked at Home Depot on 23rd Street, I met Harry Lennox and Maureen Baccarin on different days as I was the manager for the cashiers at checkout. I also met Rachel Dratch from Saturday Night Live on the train. Additionally, I encountered other celebrities at New York Comic Con. Story 40. 2009, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ben Affleck was with Jennifer Garner in Harvard Square behind the American Repertory Theater. They were in the car directly in front of me. I would not have known, but it was the day the part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at Longfellow Park in Cambridge burned down. Traffic was backed up because a pedestrian, no idea how or why, was directing traffic. I thought we would be there forever when Affleck jumped out of the car. Jennifer was driving the car directly in front of us. And the starstruck man let Ben's car, and mine, which was directly behind his, go. Not sure what happened after, because I was merrily on my way. Another time on Cape Cod in the early 2000s, I went out to breakfast at a local place at 10:30 a.m. A table over in the corner was being loud and a bit rowdy for a Saturday morning on the Cape. It was Ted Kennedy with an entourage. Pitchers of beer were on the table, and there was lots of laughter as if it were night instead of morning. He wasn't drunk, but it did seem like everyone was drinking. Story 41. I worked at a golf club once and I met Kevin McHale. He is very tall. The poor guy seemed to be having a hard time getting around. He tipped me $20 and was very nice. Story 42. Paul Rudd, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, Rob McElhenney, and Ryan Reynolds are all in the same area of Millerton, New York, where I believe Paul Rudd owns a coffee shop. Story 43. Gordon Ramsay at London Heathrow. I was having the worst day with delayed flights, and there he was, being incredibly nice to the airport staff. Completely different from his television personality. He even recommended a good place to grab breakfast while waiting. No swearing involved. Story 44. Mike Epps at a quick trip at around 2 a.m. I was completely intoxicated, and he was too. I kept calling him Day-Day. We joked around for about 5 to 10 minutes. He called me a cool white guy and gave me a fist bump. It was a funny interaction. Story 45. I saw director and actor Peter Bogdanovich while crossing 57th Street in New York City. Later that same day, I saw him again outside the Sherry Netherland Hotel talking to Woody Allen and Suni. Story 46. I saw Jimmy Kimmel in a store one time. I also ran into Blake Anderson at Amoeba Music. I didn't talk to them, but my friend told Blake he likes workaholics. Story 47. Joe and Jill Biden, Bruce Willis, Chuck Norris, Kurt Cobain, Jerry Ryan, Steve Vai, and Joe Satriani, along with Bruce Kulick, a former member of KISS. There are more individuals, but I do not remember all of them. Story 48. Jeff Saturday used to come into the restaurant where I worked in high school weekly during the off-season. Danny Granger would take his mom there regularly for Sunday lunch. This was right after the Colts won their Super Bowl, and Granger was playing for the Pacers. Both guys seemed really down to earth for professional athletes. The restaurant wasn't overly expensive or fancy, but it was still nice and had really good food. High school dances were usually our busiest nights because it was a nice enough restaurant for dressing up, but affordable for high school students. Story 49. Richard Osman was riding a bus home from Heathrow when he saw his unmistakable stature as he bent down to get into a taxi. Story 50. I have met many people, but that is not the question. I once bumped into Ian Rush and Eric Cantona on the same day in San Francisco. Americans consider them very well-known soccer players. I have seen several Liverpool footballers in real life, such as Peter Beardsley pushing his child around Tesco in a shopping cart, and Kenny Dalglish walking down Lord Street in Southport in his Liverpool Football Club coat. However, the most interesting non-football sightings were Winona Ryder at a Stereolab concert and a drunk Bobby Gillespie from Primal Scream walking down Camden High Street. Story 51. I used to do princess parties in Los Angeles, and Elizabeth Berkley attended 3 of the birthday parties I organized for her son. I think I was getting recommended through her friend group, so it's not entirely unusual, but it is a bit strange. She was very nice, but I remember she told her son in front of the other kids that I, as Elsa or another character, wasn't real. There were many other experiences, but that one stands out to me because I remember thinking, why does this keep happening? Story 52. I worked at a gentleman's club in Austin, Texas, in the early 2000s. Keanu Reeves, Roy Jones Jr., the Jackass Crew, Lemmy from Motorhead, and Johnny Hardwick, the voice of King of the Hill, are just a few that come to mind. Story 53. Morgan Freeman was at a gas station in Mississippi. I completely froze when I heard that voice in person. He was buying a pack of gum and chatting with the cashier as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Story 54. Gary Payton was a regular at the bar near my house. I have probably played a few dozen games of Golden Tee with him. Story 55. I saw Rick Astley walk out of the iHeartRadio building in New York City. It was one of those moments where I thought, wait, was that really Rick Astley? He walked by, waved to some people outside, and got into a fancy car with his driver. Story 56. Billy Joel was dating a woman who worked in the same building as I did. He often picked her up on his motorcycle. As a fellow rider, we talked about bikes most of the time. He was always friendly and enjoyable to speak with. Story 57. Miles Garrett. I was working at a candy and pop culture shop with a lot of anime items in the store. He came in, and I didn't recognize him at first, but then I realized and asked if it was him. He confirmed it was him, and I got a picture. He was really nice, though. Story 58. The lady in front of me was getting something from the counter at Dean and DeLuca in New York. I was in line just behind her. She turned, and I came face to face with Natalie Portman. Story 59. I used to live in Los Angeles, so I saw a few celebrities driving around or in stores. Jay Leno, Patrick Stewart, Richard Lewis, Doris Roberts from Everybody Loves Raymond, Lisa Kudrow, Matthew Perry, Brock Peters, and Arnold Schwarzenegger after The Terminator, but before becoming governor. Story 60. I live in New York City. I have seen Maggie Gyllenhaal, Hannibal Buress, Eric Andre, Sarah Paulson, Holland Taylor, Jeremy Allen White, Thomas Brody Sangster, Nathan Fielder, Michael Imperioli, Rory Culkin, Peter Dinklage, and Alec Baldwin at least 3 times. Story 61. I have seen many memorable moments, likely several hundred, at the San Diego Comic-Con over the last 50 years. One that stands out away from the Comic-Con was Christopher Reeve. He was attending a fundraiser for the rebuilding of the old Globe Theater in San Diego, and our theater class was there as well. I was walking backward and bumped into someone, and when I turned around, I found it was him. He was gracious and charming, and we talked for about 10 minutes about his career and my interest in theater. Then, much like Superman, he was gone, headed off to do more good for the globe. Story 62. Tim McCarver at a Broadway play, Elliot Gould in front of the World Trade Center, Steven Seagal at the height of his popularity in Staten Island at a restaurant, and Nancy Kerrigan at Disney World. That is all I can think of. Story 63. I saw Alan Cumming walking his dogs once. I saw Michael Strahan in the movie theater surrounded by a 20-person entourage. Story 64. While eating lunch one day in 1997, I noticed Mike Myers ice skating alone for a solid 30 minutes at the Plaza of the Americas in Dallas. This was just prior to the release of Austin Powers. Story 65. I sat behind Gigi Hadid at Romeo and Juliet, starring Orlando Bloom, on Broadway in 2014. She is incredibly pretty. Orlando Bloom, Johnny Depp, and Heath Ledger at the Toronto International Film Festival were all shorter than expected. The Jonas Brothers on the set of Camp Rock 2. Story 66. Not a celebrity to most, but I saw Paul O'Neill getting out of an Uber in San Francisco while I was traveling to catch a baseball game. I am a big-time Yankees fan, so it was really cool. Story 67. Gary Hart was walking behind him in San Francisco's Chinatown. Newt Gingrich was walking behind him under the Capitol Rotunda. Story 68. Lamar Odom was at JFK Airport complaining about his mother-in-law. Naomi Campbell nearly bumped into me as she got out of a taxi and rushed into the Wolseley. It was amusing. Someone was trying to cover her with a coat. Was she going to eat like that? I turned a corner on High Street, Kensington, and almost collided with Nigel Havers. Story 69. Joe Montana lives in my neighborhood. I have seen him at the market and when I am walking my dog. I have also seen Robin Williams and Nicolas Cage over the years. Story 70. My wife and I were at a bar when Burton Cummings walked in. I had encountered him in the hotel elevator the evening before and shared a brief conversation, but I thought he would not remember me. As soon as he saw me in the bar, he waved us over to join his table and entertained us with stories well after closing time. They had to take the drinks from our hands as we sat there, amazed, listening to tales like his meeting Jim Morrison. He is a true entertainer and a genuinely nice person. Story 71. My son and I saw Kevin Costner in Aspen last December. We didn't approach him but walked near him for a couple of blocks since we were heading in the same direction. Story 72. William Devane was seen at a grocery store in Provo, Utah, 2 days after I watched a television movie he appeared in. Gerard Butler was spotted at a Subway in Orem, Utah. Jeff Goldblum was at Disneyland 2 weeks ago. Story 73. Not an A-lister, but I ran into Chuck Liddell at Encore Beach Club in Las Vegas in 2016. Fast forward 5 years to EP and LP Patio in Los Angeles, and I passed by Chuck on the way to the restroom. He is the only celebrity I have ever seen in the wild, and I encounter him twice in 2 different states. Story 74. Years ago, I sat behind Stephanie McMahon and Triple H on a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to Columbus. We chatted briefly at baggage claim. They were very pleasant and friendly. Story 75. Queen of Scotty Road in the pub last night. Hulk Hogan in McDonald's. The 2 men from American Chopper. Story 76. Chris Rock at the Four Seasons Surfside in Miami. Dave Portnoy in Montauk on the beach with his ex and dog. Danielle from Summer House at Surf Lodge. The McMillan family from Walmart at Four Seasons Surfside. Many were in the suite with me at an event for New York Fashion Week. Mary J. Blige in Montauk, Anna of the North in Montauk, and others I can't remember. These are just the recent ones. Also, Dog the Bounty Hunter and his late wife at Target. Story 77. The fugitive was filming at my neighborhood bike shop. My dad and I biked by while Tommy Lee Jones was walking down the street with security guards. Two kids ran up to him with notebooks asking for autographs. I don't remember if he stopped to sign them. Story 78. Lewis Black was polite and nice to me. Christopher McDonald was not as friendly, but he was frustrated at the time, and I cannot blame him. Maury Povich and Connie Chung were both very nice and friendly. Story 79. I met Jim Carrey once at a convention. He seemed nice and relaxed. He can be just as funny in real life as he is in his movies. What you see in the gag reel for Liar Liar is basically how goofy he can get. Story 80. Chuck Woolery was extremely rude to staff and fans at the Austin airport. Valerie Bertinelli and Eddie Van Halen appeared on a Jay Leno show, and she looked up at us and said, "Please don't get that started," when we asked for his autograph, not during the show. Paula Abdul and Arsenio Hall were also at the same show. Story 81. Not at an event to see them perform or make an appearance. Carl Palmer was at Sunday brunch at the next table in Ames, Iowa. Chris Kilios was in the lobby after a United States Hockey League game in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, waiting for his son to come out of the dressing room. Story 82. Mel B from the Spice Girls was very nice to me. I didn't realize who she was until about 10 minutes after speaking with her. Story 83. Owen Wilson, Chris Rock, Joel Madden, J.R. Smith, Taryn Manning, and Iman Shumpert were present at various events. The worst encounter was probably with Iman Shumpert at a Nas concert in New York. He was very rude. J.R. Smith was the most laid back and signed a New York Knicks hat for me when I saw him at the Freehold Mall. I saw him again at Taj in New York City. Chris Rock and Joel Madden were at a company event. Joel Madden was very nice, while Chris Rock politely declined to smoke marijuana with me. Story 84. I met Jimmy Carter on a flight to London. He came down the aisle and shook everyone's hand. He had a warm presence, and I felt safe on that flight. Story 85. I saw Kiefer Sutherland at a restaurant in San Francisco about 20 years ago. I was surprised that he looked smaller in person. I didn't disturb him. I just smiled, and he returned it. Story 86. I met the band Smashing Pumpkins when they were on a small club tour before they became famous. I had never heard of them and was truly impressed by their music. It was a tiny club with maybe 50 people in attendance. I talked with James IHA briefly and told him, "You guys are going to be big." The very next week, I saw them on MTV. The crew of the film Bridges of Madison County also hung out at the cafe where I worked in Iowa. I also met Michael McKean there. I used to serve Bobby McFerrin at a wine bar in Minneapolis. Additionally, I saw Jared Leto filming in front of the Dakota Building in New York City when he was portraying Mark David Chapman. Story 87. I walked past Martin Freeman once. He was wearing a strange hat. I also saw Steve Coogan in character as Alan Partridge during filming and Paul Whitehouse a few weeks ago. Story 88. I was at an import-export convention in Shenzhen when I noticed a crowd following someone on a Segway. Curiously, I went to see who it was and discovered that it was Jackie Chan. Story 89. A few months ago, I randomly met Terry Bradshaw, the former quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers, at an Olive Garden in Springfield, Illinois. I grew up in Pittsburgh and have been a lifelong Steelers fan. I moved to Springfield over 20 years ago and did not expect to meet one of my childhood heroes here at an Olive Garden. Story 90. I saw several interactions. However, the best was with Chance the Rapper. He had just gotten off a flight, and I recognized him. It was a bit unusual because he was wearing his trademark baseball hat. He stopped and we chatted for a bit. It was a great experience. Story 91. I sat directly next to 2 Chainz, his child, and the child's mother at a restaurant in Atlanta. I didn't try to interact with him. He was very ordinary and just requested that no pork be brought to the table at Fogo de Chao. Story 92. I have seen a lot in mountain communities. The moment that stands out the most is when my wife and I took a break on a hiking trail in Telluride, and Catherine Keener casually walked up and chatted with us for a minute. She may not be extremely famous, but it was a memorable experience. Story 93. I have been fortunate to meet several celebrities, but the funniest experience was meeting Lamar Odom, a retired professional basketball player, and Sada Baby, a rapper known for his popular songs on TikTok on consecutive days. Story 94. I briefly saw Bruce Willis come out of a theater where he was performing. I believe it was in New York City a few years ago. Story 95. Mick Jagger at an outdoor restaurant in Sydney, Australia, in 1989. I offered him my chair, which annoyed his bodyguards, but he was very polite and said thank you. Story 96. Mainly supermodels include Linda Evangelista, Kate Moss, and Jodie Kidd. Stephen Fry, Alexei Sayle, and possibly David Beckham were also present, as his car had partially tinted windows. Story 97. Just randomly seen in public. When I lived in New York City, Whoopi Goldberg during her comedy show on Broadway, and Bebe Neuwirth when she was in Chicago. Little Steven from Bruce Springsteen's band in a restaurant in New Jersey. Story 98. Laura San Giacomo from Pretty Woman is my next-door neighbor. She is very kind. Her husband, Matt Adler, was in Teen Wolf, which is a bonus. Story 99. I sat next to Jeff Ross at Chili's a few years ago. He kept telling jokes and was very social. I recognized him as someone I knew but couldn't put a name to his face until I saw something on Instagram later that day, and it clicked. Story 100. Johnny Depp's mother lived in the same neighborhood as my parents. You always knew when he was visiting. There would be black SUVs everywhere around her house. Story 101. I saw Macklemore shopping at my local Goodwill in 2013. He was very friendly to everyone who approached him and was buying a rocker glider for a nursery. Story 102. I haven't met in public, but I attend an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting online, and it's a celebrity meeting. Let's just say a lot of people you have probably watched are in this meeting I attend. Story 103. Being out and about. I am pretty sure I once saw Leah Thompson driving in another car several years ago. My dad encountered celebrities frequently when my parents lived in West Hollywood before I was born in the 1980s through the early 1990s. He once got an obscene gesture from Roseanne Barr when she thought my dad cut her off. He also saw Harrison Ford driving while eating his lunch outside in the early 1980s. He was at a newsstand when George Wendt, Norm from Cheers, came along to buy a magazine. He said he would see Woody Harrelson driving often. My favorite story is that while helping his boss one day, he briefly spoke on the phone with Steve Jobs. Story 104. I used to live in London, so I've seen a few notable people. Once, I saw Guillermo del Toro at FOP in London buying DVD box sets, and another time I saw Christopher Eccleston out for a run on the same street. My favorite encounter was bumping into V-Man from Slipknot at a Conjurer concert. He asked for a selfie because I was wearing a Downbeat t-shirt. His friend runs the Downbeat podcast. Story 105. Lyle Lovett came into PetSmart when I worked there. I was told he had been in a few times before but didn't like to be recognized or acknowledged. He was wearing a belt with a giant buckle that said, LLE. It was an unusual way to be inconspicuous. Story 106. Brian Keith in the 1970s in Hawaii, Ron Glass on a street in New York City in the 1980s, and John Lodge, the bass player for the Moody Blues, outside a venue before his performance that night. I would say that politicians who are campaigning in public do not count. Story 107. I had a beer with Bruce Willis in his hometown. He would visit his parents, and a group of his high school friends would gather at a bar whenever he was in town. I worked with them, so I joined them. Story 108. Eric Andre, Kendrick Lamar, Alfonso Ribeiro, Samuel Jackson, Henry Winkler, George Lopez, Abigail Breslin, Keke Palmer, The Game, Cat Williams, Jane Levy, Jackie Long, Ali Machaca, Big Boy, Terry Crews, Snoop Dogg, W.C., Amelia Clark, Elizabeth Coop, Rachel Bloom, Abigail Jacobson, Clea Duvall, Mary Holland, Felicia Day, Jeremy Suarez, the cast of Vikings, Yes, she is more beautiful in person. Some of these aren't incredibly famous, but they were enough for me to recognize them. Story 109. Eric McCormick, known for his role as Will in Will and Grace, lived near me in Vancouver and would occasionally visit my store. He was always friendly and personable. What stood out was how incredibly handsome he was in person. He typically dressed casually, but even in jeans and a t-shirt, his clothes appeared expensive, not flashy, just high quality. Story 110. I have worked in sports for many years, too many to count. One memorable encounter was when I was in college, dating my now wife. I was in San Diego and she was in Orange County, so I would drive up to spend some weekends with her. On one of these weekends, her little sister was visiting, so to do something fun, we went to Los Angeles, drove around, and took a tour of NBC studios. After finishing the tour, we drove down the nearby Main Street and stopped at Taco Bell to eat. This was one of the old-style Taco Bells where you ordered at a window and sat outside. I glanced to my left and saw a shirtless man standing with his girlfriend. It was heavyweight contender Randall Tex Cobb. I was a huge boxing fan at the time, while my girlfriend and her sister had no idea who he was. Besides going the distance with Larry Holmes a couple of years earlier, he was acting. This encounter would have been after Uncommon Valor but before *Raising Arizona. I approached him and said something like, "Hey, Mr. Cobb, I'm a big fan. It's nice to meet you." His response was, "Hey, my daddy's name is Mr. Cobb. You can call me Randall or Tex." We all got our orders, sat at adjacent tables, and chatted through lunch. He was a nice guy. Story 111. I opened the door at work to see Allison Janey waiting in line with a group of friends for dinner. Surprised me for a moment. Story 112. I accidentally played paintball with Tommy Lee once. I was too young to know who he was. He was very nice and friendly, and he was more than willing to take pictures and just hang out. Story 113. My mom and I were walking around a shopping center in Hawaii when she said, "That's Henry Winkler." She stopped to say hello, and he was very nice and friendly. He said, "Aye," to me. I was 10 at the time, though I had no idea who he was, but I never forgot the interaction. Story 114. Peter Jennings was at the Delta Crown Room at John F. Kennedy Airport years ago, carrying a shopping bag from one of the airport shops. Like many celebrities, he was shorter in real life than I had imagined. Story 115. I have encountered far too many to list. There was a time when you could run into actual movie, television, and music stars just about anywhere in Los Angeles. They shopped for their own groceries, clothing, and household items. They went to movie theaters and sat next to you without a bodyguard. They attended concerts at small venues. They dined at ordinary restaurants. They drove regular cars. I wouldn't recognize any of the so-called celebrities today and honestly wouldn't care. Story 116. I think local celebrity is more apt, but I worked as a valet one summer and returned a car to sports announcer Steve Fisiak. We used his name when we parked the car, so the first thing I did was ask for his name. He said Steve and started to spell his last name. It took him getting to Pitchwis for me to realize who he was, because he just looked like a normal guy. But the second he spoke, my brain went, "You know that voice?" The conversation went exactly like this. "Oh, hey, are you?" "Yep. You know I studied." "Yeah, they're looking good this year." "Okay. But thanks for getting my car." I just wanted to tell him I went to college for broadcasting, but I understood. This was during the 2014 World Series run for the Kansas City Royals, and I think he just wanted to get home. He tipped well. Not like, "Here's $100, but $10, which was a good tip for that location. I wasn't there long enough to get any of the more infamous clients. Rumor had it that almost everyone thought George Brett was a real jerk, but the few who understood his sense of humor loved him. Jamal Charles's car always had the passenger seat floorboard filled with empty cups from a convenience store. From what I heard, the problem people were never really the celebrities, but the upper middle-class baby boomers who thought that their 6-year-old mid-range BMW entitled them to special treatment and who tipped like $1.50 at most. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.